What I want to do is share with you some excerpts out of the book to give you a sense of the breadth and a little bit of the depth of ways in which insects have been used to inflict pain and suffering on one another. And so what we're going to do is kind of jump ahead. A lot of the early part of the book talks about the ways in which insects were used in warfare for thousands of years. But we're going to jump ahead. And I suppose just by way of very brief background, let me just sort of plant in your mind that humans have been using insects to inflict pain on one another ever since the Paleolithic. They've been using wasps and ants. There's good archaeological, anthropological evidence that we've been flinging wasps and ants at each other for thousands of years, mostly to drive an enemy from a stronghold or repulse a marauding force. We heaped pots of angry ants. There's a great story in the Middle East of having repulsed a Roman invasion with jars of scorpions. And these things were wickedly effective. In fact, for about 1,500 years, we'd been loading up catapults with beehives. It was a very common practice. As a matter of fact, in some parts of the Roman Empire, there was a shortage of honey because they had basically heaved too many of the hives. So when it came to using insects as a form of torture in the 19th century, you might think that this long, several thousand year history would have been such that folks would have conscripted stinging insects to inflict pain on one another. But, as we're going to see in just a moment, for a truly demonic mind, there was actually another six-legged instrument of torture and misery, and one that perhaps nobody in the room would expect. So, in terms of structure, we're going to start here by looking at entomological warfare, terror, and torture. And we're going to start with torture, and in particular, the way that insects can be used to inflict pain. So we'll just pick up this story at a point where I think it will still make sense. If gruesome martyrdom is sufficient qualification for canonization, then Charles Stoddart and Arthur Connolly are surely the patron saints of insect and torture. These two Englishmen became pawns in the great game, a political chess match played out between two empires. The contest opened in 1837 when Queen Victoria ascended to the throne and Britain began to establish a strategic presence in India. The opening moves from the Russians were made by Tsar Nicholas Pavlovich, who sought to expand his empire to the south. Now, the British feared that the Tsar had designs on India, or would at least impede their own colonial plans by controlling Central Asia, and the great game was on. Now, both sides realized that the region that we now refer to the Stans, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan, was vital to their imperial schemes. Each monarch dispatched agents to convince the local rulers that benevolent occupation was necessary to keep out the British brutes, or the Russian reprobates, depending on who was doing the talking. The Russians were based in Orenburg, just north of the present-day border with Kazakhstan, and the British operated from northern India. And if one drew a straight line from Orenburg to Delhi, the midpoint was the walled city of Bukhara, the place where Stoddart and Connolly would meet their fate. Bukhara was viewed as a sinister place well before the entomological abominations came to light. No European had set foot in this forbidding and strategic stronghold for 100 years. In a desolate landscape bloodied by marauding tribes, Bukhara was a cultural oasis endowed with palaces, mosques, and bazaars. Such an important political and economic center could not long remain a mystery to the empires who sought to control Asia. Russia sent diplomatic mission to Bukhara in 1820 to recover their imprisoned countrymen and foster diplomatic ties. Britain countered by sending delegations in 1824 and 1832. British concerns were deepened after the Russians sent a second mission in 1835 and also began forging ties with the Persian and Afghani rulers. Sound familiar, eh? In response, Sir John McNeill, the British ambassador to Persia, decided to send his own emissary to Bukhara to secure the release of Russian slaves and prisoners. That sounds a bit odd, but there was no altruism involved. The British wanted to deny the Russians an excuse for invasion. And in addition, the envoy was to offer his country's assistance in case of Russian invasion and assure the emir he had nothing to fear from a British presence in his city. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Stoddart was chosen for the job. McNeill figured that Stoddart's service in Persia and Asia provided the necessary experience with an emir. The ambassador was tragically mistaken. As one of Stoddart's fellow officers remarked, "To attack or defend a fortress, no better man than Stoddart could be found. But for a diplomatic mission requiring coolness and self-command, a man less adapted to the purpose could not readily have been met with." Apparently soldiers aren't always good diplomats. Nor did McNeill fully comprehend the nature of the emir, Nasrullah Bahudar Khan. His official title, the shadow of God upon earth, might have been a tip-off. Presumably, the moniker used by the emir's subjects was not known to the British ambassador. Behind closed doors, the citizens of Bukhara simply referred to their ruler as the Butcher. Nasrullah ascended the throne in 1826 through the expedient of murdering those who had prior claims, thus leapfrogging the corpses of his father and two older brothers. Concerned that turnaround might be fair play, he extended his homicidal streak to include his three younger brothers and several other relatives. Stoddart himself, in a letter smuggled back to England in 1839, concisely described Nasrullah. He wrote, "The emir is mad." The path that Stoddart took to arrive at this conclusion began on December 17, 1838, with his arrival in Bukhara. Upon riding into the walled city, Stoddart proceeded to the main square in front of the palace to present himself. He was not aware that riding there was forbidden, nor did he know that when the emir rode up, a visiting horseman was expected to dismount. Instead, in accordance with British military tradition, he remained in his saddle and saluted the emir, whereupon, according to one source, the emir, quote, looked at him fixedly for some time and then passed without saying a word. Rather inauspicious start. Stoddart gained an audience with the emir and handed the aggrieved ruler a letter of introduction. Upon seeing that the missive had not been signed by Queen Victoria herself, Nasrullah was deeply insulted. Again, the diplomatic disaster was fully consummated when the emir was slipped a message by one of Stoddart's native servants. The poor Englishman was doubly betrayed. The letter was from the emir of Herat, one of Stoddart's earlier acquaintances, who denounced the Brit as a dangerous spy. Nasrullah had a special place for such odious enemies. And that's how Charles Stoddart became the first Westerner to experience the terror of the bug pit. The local people referred to the infamous pit as Siacha, which meant black well or black hole. It was located in the prison compound behind the emir's palace so that he had ready access to the Chamber of Horrors. 21 feet deep, covered with an iron grill and accessible only by a rope, the pit would have been an awful place even without the creatures lurking in the depths. Nasrullah seeded the pit with rats and reptiles, rather standard fare for dungeons. The emir's piece de resistance, the innovation for which he attained infamy, was the insects he used to ensure a constant torturous experience for his victims. The foulest of the emir's six-legged minions were the assassin bugs, although their eight-legged cousins, the sheep ticks, added to the torment. When there were no unfortunate souls to feed the cold-blooded menagerie, chunks of raw meat were dropped into the pit. The arthropods would not have found such fare to be particularly appealing, so we might suppose that the emir managed to find live victims on a fairly regular basis.